The glass didn't shatter when it hit the marble floor. It simply cracked, a single clean fracture running through the crystal stem, and the red wine inside bled out slowly, like something wounded that hadn't yet decided to die. The woman who dropped it was not the one everyone was staring at. They were staring at Lena. Lena Beaumont had worked 3 jobs in her 26 years of life. She had waited tables at a Waffle House off I-40 where the grease smell never fully washed out of her hair. She had stocked shelves at a 24-hour pharmacy in a neighborhood where the overnight shift required memorizing which customers to watch and which ones to talk down gently. And for the past 8 months, she had cleaned rooms, pressed linens, and hauled laundry carts through the service corridors of Hargrove Manor, the sprawling Connecticut estate of Roman Hargrove, a man whose name appeared in the financial press as a shipping magnate and private equity pioneer, and whose name appeared in other, unprinted conversations as something far more dangerous. She had taken the job because her mother's insulin wasn't cheap, and neither was the back rent on their apartment in Bridgeport. The manor paid 3 times what anything legal and comparable would offer, and Lena had learned not to ask why. She was not built for invisibility. At 270 pounds, Lena moved through the estate's narrow service passages with the particular care of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating spaces not designed for her. She had wide hips that grazed door frames, thick arms that strained the seams of the standard-issue grey uniform, and a round, open face that flushed deeply with exertion in a way that made the other housekeeping staff, lean women from 3 different countries who communicated primarily through meaningful glances, exchanged those glances often in her direction. She knew they laughed. Not cruelly, not all of them, but with that specific pity that somehow cut deeper than cruelty. Lena endured it. She endured the aching knees and the sweat that collected at the base of her spine, and the way the head housekeeper, Mrs. Lena Beaumont, assigned her the heaviest carts and the highest floors without a word of explanation, because the paycheck landed in her account every 2 weeks without fail, and her mother's numbers had been stable for 4 months. What she had not anticipated, what she could not have anticipated, was Eleanor. Eleanor Hargrove was Roman's grandmother. She was 81 years old, barely 5 feet tall, and possessed of a posture so imperiously correct that she made the marble columns of the manor look slouched by comparison. To the staff, she was Mrs. Jill, addressed formally, approached carefully, never startled. To her grandson, she was the only person on earth he spoke to with anything resembling softness. Eleanor had been slipping for 2 years, not dramatically, not in ways that photographed well for the visiting family lawyers or the estate doctors who came quarterly and left with generously padded invoices. It was the small things, the way she sometimes paused mid-sentence and looked toward a window as though someone had called her name from a great distance. The way she occasionally set out tea for a husband who had been buried since 2009. The way she wondered. It was Lena who found her the first time. 3 in the morning, and Lena had been hauling a cart of pressed linens to the East Wing storage room when she turned a corner and nearly collided with the old woman, barefoot on the cold corridor floor in a silk nightgown, holding a leather-bound photograph album and looking for the library that had been relocated to a different wing 17 years ago. Lena had not called Mrs. Farrow. She had not radioed the security desk. She had simply crouched down, awkwardly, with the particular clumsiness of a large body in a narrow hallway, and said, very quietly, "Mrs. H, the library moved, remember? Let me take you back to your room, and we'll find the photos in the morning, when the light is better." Eleanor had looked at her for a long moment with those sharp grey eyes that still occasionally cut right through the fog. "You're the new one," Eleanor said, "the kind-faced one." "Yes, ma'am, I'm Lena." Lena. Eleanor had repeated it like she was testing the weight of it. Then she had taken the hand Lena offered, the thick, warm hand with the chipped thumbnail and the calluses from the Carter, and allowed herself to be walked back to her suite. After that, Eleanor asked for Lena specifically. Asked for her at breakfast when she wanted someone to read the newspaper aloud. Asked for her when the afternoon light turned strange and confusing and she needed a steady voice to pull her back. Roman's head of security had flagged it twice in the weekly estate briefing. Roman, according to Mrs. Farrow, had simply noted it and moved on. Lena didn't know if Roman Hargrove had ever truly seen her. She had glimpsed him, of course. Everyone had glimpsed him. He was 40 years old, built with the particular density of a man who had never once needed to be approachable, with dark eyes that processed a room the way a security camera did, efficiently, without sentiment. When he walked through the manor, the temperature seemed to drop 2 degrees. The staff straightened. The guards went still. Even Mrs. Farrow's permanently rigid posture managed to find a new gear. He was not a man anyone hoped to be noticed by. The night everything fractured was the night of the Alderman dinner. Roman Hargrove hosted it annually. 12 men, 3 women. A rotating cast of politicians and international financiers who arrived in black cars without plates and left with the particular looseness of people who had just confirmed something very important to their personal survival. The gathering was served on the manor's formal dining level, a room of candlelight and dark wood paneling where even the silence felt expensive. Lena had been assigned to the lower service corridor that evening, restocking the warming station and keeping the past hors d'oeuvre trays replenished. She was not supposed to be visible. She was supposed to be the mechanism behind the seamlessness. It was going fine until it wasn't. She was navigating a tray of stuffed mushrooms through the narrow door from the service passage into the staging area when the door swung wider than she anticipated. Her elbow caught the edge of the warming shelf. The tray lurched. She caught it. Barely. All 270 pounds of her suddenly very focused. But the motion sent her hip into the staging table, which rattled, which sent a crystal glass of water rolling toward the edge, and the glass went over. It didn't shatter. It cracked. The water spread across the marble in a slow, quiet sheet. Lena stood there with her heart slamming against her ribs, half expecting an alarm. What came instead was a voice. Unbelievable. Clarissa Vane stood in the interior doorway between the staging area and the dining room. She was 34, blonde in a way that required significant maintenance, and wore a gown the color of old champagne that had probably cost more than Lena's car. She was Roman's intended, not officially. Not in any documented way, but in the way that everyone in the estate seemed to understand. Clarissa was a Vane. The Vane family controlled ports in 4 states, and had been circling the Hargrove operation for 2 years, and the alliance had been negotiated at a level so far above Lena's pay grade that it might as well have happened on another planet. Clarissa looked at the cracked glass. She looked at the spreading water. She looked at Lena. Are you actually serious right now? It wasn't a question. I'm so sorry, Miss Vane. I'll clean this up immediately. Do you have any idea what this evening is? Clarissa's voice was low and controlled, which somehow made it worse than shouting. Do you understand what is happening in that room right now? And you're back here causing a scene like a... She stopped herself, let her gaze travel over Lena slowly, comprehensively, the way someone reads a receipt and finds it unsatisfying. Like you always do. I've seen you, knocking into things, heaving yourself around this house. It's embarrassing. You're embarrassing. You're embarrassing. Lena's face went very hot. She zipped at the floor. Get this cleaned up, Clarissa said, quietly, and then stay out of the way. Some of us have actual work to do tonight. She turned and went back through the door. Lena stood in the staging area for 3 full seconds, not moving. Then she set the mushroom tray down carefully, pulled a linen from the clean stack, and got on her knees, slowly, painfully, and pressed it against the water on the floor. She was still on her knees when she heard it. It came from the far end of the service corridor, a sound that made no sense in context, a thin, confused voice saying the name of a man who had been dead for 15 years. Harold, where are the children? Lena was on her feet before she had finished thinking. She found Eleanor at the end of the east service corridor, 20 feet from the main dining level entrance. The old woman had somehow come down in the elevator that the staff used for linens, still dressed in her dinner clothes from the earlier portion of the evening. She had been seated for the cocktail hour before being quietly escorted to her private sitting room, as was the arrangement. But somewhere in the transition, Eleanor had lost the thread. She was standing very still, holding her evening bag in both hands, her grey eyes fixed on a door that led to the boiler utility room. Mrs. H. Lena kept her voice low and steady. "It's Lena, you're in the east corridor." Eleanor turned. The confusion moved across her face like weather. "I was looking for," Harold said to meet. "I know. Let me take you back upstairs." Lena held out her hand. "We'll find him from there." Eleanor looked at the hand. Then she reached out and took it. They were halfway back to the service elevator when the door at the far end of the corridor opened. Clarissa Vane stepped through it. She took in the scene with the particular rapid calculation of someone who had grown up in rooms where information was currency. Eleanor, disoriented, clutching the hand of the heavy-set housekeeping staff in the grey uniform. The corridor. The silence. What is going on? Again, not a question. "Mrs. Hargrove needed assistance," Lena said. "I'm taking her back to her suite." "You." Clarissa's expression shifted into something that Lena didn't have a clean word for. It wasn't just contempt, it was something colder. "You're not supposed to be in this corridor during the dinner. And she is not supposed to be seen like this. Do you understand how this looks? If any of those men in there see her wandering around confused, looking for some dead man." "Please keep your voice down," Lena said quietly. The words surprised both of them. Clarissa stared. Eleanor, still holding Lena's hand, had gone very still. "I'm sorry," Clarissa said. "She can hear you." Lena kept her voice even, kept her eyes steady. "She understands more than you think she does. Please keep your voice down." The look that moved across Clarissa Vane's face in that moment was the look of someone encountering a form of resistance they had not anticipated and did not know what to do with. For half a second she looked almost human in her confusion. Then the calculation returned. "Get her upstairs," Clarissa said, voice very controlled. "And then clear your personal items from the housekeeping room. I'll speak to Mrs. Farrow in the morning." She turned back toward the door. "Clarissa." The voice came from behind her. Roman Hargrove stood at the far end of the corridor. He was still in his dinner jacket, a glass of scotch in one hand, and he was looking at the tableau in the hall with an expression that Lena could not read because she had never had occasion to look directly at his face for this long. "Roman." Clarissa recovered instantly, her voice warming, her posture recalibrating toward him like a compass needle finding north. "I was just handling a situation. One of the staff brought your grandmother down here during the dinner. I don't know how she got past the upstairs arrangement, but—" Roman was not looking at Clarissa. He was looking at his grandmother's hand, held in Lena's wide, steady grip. He was looking at the way Eleanor was standing, not cowering, not further distressed, but calm, leaning slightly into the presence of the large woman beside her. "Nana." His voice changed. "Just slightly. Just enough." Eleanor turned toward him. The fog in her eyes receded a fraction. "Roman." "I was looking for the children." "I know." He walked toward her, past Clarissa, past the staging door, directly toward the two of them. When he reached Eleanor, he cupped her face in both hands with a gentleness that seemed to belong to a different man in a different life. "They're upstairs. Let's go up." He looked at Lena. "You found her." It wasn't a question either, but it was nothing like the way Clarissa asked things. "Yes, sir." "Has this happened before?" Lena hesitated. "A few times." Something moved behind Roman's eyes. "You didn't report it." "No." "Why not?" She thought about it honestly before she answered. "Because she asked me not to." The silence in the corridor was absolute. Roman studied Lena's face for a moment, not the way Clarissa had, not the comprehensive, dismissive scan, but the way you look at something when you're trying to understand it accurately. Then he said simply, "Take the elevator up with us." Clarissa said, "Roman, your guests." "Give me 10 minutes, Roman said, and the tone of it ended the conversation. In the elevator, Eleanor told Lena about a summer she had spent in Maine in 1974. Roman listened. Lena listened. Nobody said anything that mattered except Eleanor, and Eleanor said everything. When they reached the private suite, and Eleanor was settled, Roman walked Lena back to the elevator in the private wing hallway. He stopped before she reached it. You said she asked you not to report it. Yes. When was the first time you found her? Lena told him. The library corridor. 3 in the morning. The photograph album. Roman was quiet for a moment that stretched out long enough to be uncomfortable. How long have you worked here? 8 months. And in 8 months, nobody else. I don't think anyone else was in the right place at the right time, Lena said, because she was not going to say what she actually thought, which was that the other staff moved through the manor with the efficient self-preservation of people who understood what they were not supposed to see. Roman looked at her for a long moment. What's your name? Lena Beaumont. He nodded once, as if filing it. Then he said, Go back to your post. We'll talk tomorrow. Miss Vane said. I heard what Miss Vane said. Lena went back to her post. She did not sleep well that night, partly from the adrenaline of the corridor encounter and partly because she was fairly certain she was going to be terminated in the morning, and she was already doing the arithmetic on which bill she could defer the longest. She was in the housekeeping supply room at 7:15 the next morning, starting her regular shift inventory, when Mrs. Farrow appeared in the doorway with an expression Lena had never seen on her face before. Uncertainty. Mr. Hargrove wants to see you, Mrs. Farrow said. His private study, 9 o'clock. Am I? I don't know, Mrs. Farrow said, which was the first honest answer the woman had ever given her. The private study was on the 3rd floor, a room lined with dark bookshelves and smelling of paper and whatever Scotch Roman Hargrove favored. He was standing at the window when Lena was shown in, looking out over the grounds where the November trees had stripped themselves down to their essential structures. He turned when she entered. He had not slept much either. She could see it in the particular tight economy of his face. Sit down, Miss Beaumont. She sat. He did not sit. He stayed at the window. I spoke to Dr. Reyes this morning, my grandmother's physician. A pause. He told me she has shown improvement in orientation over the past 4 months, relative to where she was in the spring. He paused again. He attributed it to a change in medication. Lena said nothing. It wasn't medication, Roman said. It wasn't a question. I just rearranged her schedule a little, Lena said carefully. Made sure she had consistency. Same faces at the same times. Familiar things in familiar places. It helps. She stopped herself. I read about it. I'm not a nurse or anything. Why did you read about it? She thought about how to answer that. Because she mattered, Lena said finally. She was kind to me when she didn't have to be. And she mattered, so I wanted to do things right. Roman Hargrove looked at her for a long time. Then he said, Clarissa Vane will no longer be accessing the estate. Lena blinked. The engagement, if it could be called that, was a business arrangement, one that I have reconsidered. His voice was absolutely flat and matter-of-fact, the way you might describe a vendor contract. What happened in that corridor last night made several things clear to me. Sir, I don't want you to feel like you need to. I fired one person this morning, Roman said. It was not you. The silence settled. I'm moving my grandmother's care to a more structured arrangement, he continued. She'll have a private nurse, but she has specifically requested that you continue as her companion during the afternoon hours. He looked at the window again. That request will be honored, with appropriate compensation which would be considerably different from your current pay grade. Lena stared at him. I don't understand. You protected her, Roman said simply, in the corridor when Clarissa was... He stopped. Something moved across his jaw. You put yourself between my grandmother and someone who was making her feel small. You've been doing it quietly for 8 months without being asked, without recognition, and without pay commensurate with what you are actually doing. He turned from the window and looked at her directly. I don't take that lightly. I wasn't doing it for anything, Lena said, and her voice came out thicker than she intended. I know, Roman said. That's why it matters. What happened over the next month was not a movie. Lena would have told you that plainly. There was no single dramatic transformation, no scene where she appeared in a beautiful dress and everyone gasped. What happened was quieter and stranger and more real than that. She moved into the companion role with Eleanor. She spent her afternoons reading to the old woman, doing puzzles with her, taking slow walks through the winter garden when Eleanor's clarity was good, and sitting close and speaking in a steady voice when it wasn't. Eleanor blossomed in small ways that the visiting medical staff noted carefully in their assessments and could not fully explain. Lena's mother's insulin, her next 3 months of prescriptions, appeared, covered, through an arrangement that Mrs. Farrow delivered the news of with the same neutral professionalism she applied to everything. Lena cried in the supply room for 4 minutes and then went back to the garden. She saw Roman more than she expected to. He was not, it turned out, a man who expressed himself through speeches. He expressed himself through presence, sitting in the corner of Eleanor's parlor in the early evenings with a briefing folder, not talking, just being there, ensuring that Lena's afternoon shift ended in time to take the car service he had quietly assigned to her route home, leaving a specific tea she'd mentioned once appearing on the tray beside Eleanor's afternoon reading chair. Lena noticed all of it. She didn't know what to do with any of it. Eleanor noticed her noticing. "He's not as frightening as he performs," Eleanor said one afternoon, over a puzzle of the Vermont countryside in autumn. "He learned to perform it young because the alternative was being consumed." Lena placed a piece of orange leaf into its corner. "I'm not frightened of him." "No," Eleanor said with what sounded like satisfaction. "You're not." It was 6 weeks after the corridor night when Clarissa Vane returned. Not in person. Clarissa Vane was smarter than that. Smarter, as it turned out, than Roman had given her credit for in certain specific and dangerous ways. The information arrived through Roman's underboss, a quiet moving man named Caulfield who appeared in the study doorway one Tuesday morning, while Lena happened to be delivering Eleanor's breakfast tray to the connecting sitting room, and overheard 2 sentences through the cracked door before she understood she had heard too much. Clarissa Vane had not simply left. She had gone to her father with the specific nature of Eleanor's condition, a thing she had clearly had confirmed, somehow in the weeks since, and Lawrence Vane was not a man who let an advantage lie unused. The Vane family had been collecting debts on the Hargrove operation for 15 years. What Clarissa had handed her father was the clearest leverage he had ever held. The matriarch, mentally compromised, improperly managed, never disclosed to the appropriate authorities, and a paper trail that could, in certain hands, be shaped into something that looked like elder neglect. The goal was not prosecution. The goal was control. A signature. An arrangement that put Lawrence Vane in the operational seat of 3 Hargrove-held port contracts under the implied threat of a report filed with the state. Lena stood in the connecting room with the breakfast tray until the words were fully assembled in her mind. Then she set the tray down on the side table. She walked to the study door. She knocked. "Come." She pushed the door open. Caulfield looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating rapidly. Roman looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. "How much did you hear?" Roman said. "Enough," Lena said. She walked into the room. She told him what she knew, not what she'd overheard in the past 30 seconds, but what she had been accumulating quietly over 8 months of moving invisibly through the estate, the specific night Clarissa had been in Eleanor's private corridor alone, 2 months before the dinner, for 40 minutes, during which Lena had noticed the door to Eleanor's medication cabinet had been disturbed. The way Clarissa had asked the estate's medical coordinator 3 specific questions about documentation protocols in a conversation Lena had overheard in the laundry corridor, the date, the time, the exact phrasing she remembered because she had a memory for things that felt wrong in rooms where she was supposed to be invisible. Caulfield was writing before she finished. Roman was very still. When she stopped, he said, "You've been carrying this." "I didn't know what it was," she said. "I knew something was off. I didn't know what to do with it." "You're doing something with it now." "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Caulfield. "Get Morrison. And get the paper filed before end of business." He paused. "The accurate paper. About Eleanor's care. The documentation. The arrangements. Filed correctly today, so there's nothing for Lawrence Vane to weaponize because we weaponized it first with the truth." Caulfield nodded once and left. The room was quiet. That will end it, Roman said. Not immediately, but it will end it. I know, Lena said, though she didn't entirely. You didn't have to come in here, Roman said. Yes, I did. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face, which was simply this. He didn't have a prepared response. What followed was not immediate either. Roman Hargrove was not a man built for rapid emotional disclosures, and Lena Beaumont was not a woman who had ever in her 26 years been given sustained reason to believe that the powerful people in rooms above her were operating in good faith. Trust, between the two of them, was a thing constructed slowly out of small exact moments over the remaining weeks of that winter. He stopped by the garden when she and Eleanor were walking. He asked Eleanor questions and listened to the answers, real ones, even when the answers were about Harold or about Maine or about something from a year that hadn't happened recently. He sat across from Lena once at the small table in Eleanor's sitting room and stayed for an hour. And they talked about nothing operationally significant, about her mother's health, about the neighborhood in Bridgeport, about a book Eleanor had been reading aloud that neither of them had finished. And at the end of it, Roman said, "You should have dinner with me on Thursday," in the same tone he used to everything, which was flat and direct, and Lena had said, "Okay," in the same tone she used when she meant it. The Lawrence Vane situation resolved without blood, which Roman told her afterward was not his preference, but was the correct outcome, given the specific leverage available. The paper filing had been precise and preemptive, the disclosure complete, and Lawrence Vane had found himself holding a threat that had been diffused at the source. The port contracts were renegotiated on different terms. Clarissa Vane did not reappear. Lena's mother met Eleanor in February, when Eleanor was having a very clear week and asked to meet the woman Lena had mentioned, which meant Lena had mentioned her, which Eleanor pointed out with audible satisfaction. They played cards for 2 hours. Eleanor won. There was one evening, early March, the winter light just beginning to remember. It had another gear. When Roman came to the garden where Lena was sitting with Eleanor, while the old woman dozed lightly in the weak afternoon sun, he sat beside Lena without saying anything, and they watched the grounds together for a while, and then he said, "I want to tell you something." "Okay. You walked into a corridor in November and found her, and you did the right thing, and then you kept doing the right thing for 8 months before I ever knew your name." He was looking at the garden, and when everything collapsed, he walked into my study and handed me the piece I didn't have. He paused. "I don't take things for granted. But I've been taking the wrong things for granted my whole life, and I don't intend to continue." Lena looked at her hands in her lap. "I wasn't doing any of it for—" "I know," he said. "You've said that. It's still true. I know that too." He looked at her. "That's the whole point, Lena." She looked back at him. Eleanor, in the garden chair between them, opened her eyes and said without preamble, "Oh, for heaven's sake, just hold her hand, Roman." And after a moment, a beat that was not cinematic, that was slightly awkward, that was entirely real, he did. The woman who had shown up to Hargrove Manor 8 months ago with a cart too heavy for the elevator and a paycheck too important to lose had not arrived looking for anything except stability. She had not schemed. She had not positioned. She had simply, repeatedly, in the quiet service corridors and the pre-dawn hallways and the difficult evenings of a long, hard winter, done the right thing for the person in front of her. It turned out that in the world Roman Hargrove had built, a world constructed on leverage and calculation and the precise management of who owed whom, that quality was so rare as to be, in its way, utterly disarming. And in the long, complicated history of the Hargrove estate, with its debts and its alliances and its decades of carefully held power, it was Lena Beaumont, her thick hands and her quiet voice and her absolute refusal to look away from the person who needed her, who rewrote the last chapter. I keep thinking about the moment Lena set that breakfast tray down on the side table. Not the dramatic moments, not the corridor, not the study, not the garden at the end. That one quiet gesture. She heard 2 sentences through a cracked door, understood immediately what they meant, and instead of walking away, which would have been so easy, so reasonable, so completely understandable given everything she stood to lose, She set the tray down and walked toward the problem. That's the thing nobody talks about when they talk about courage. It almost never looks like courage when it's happening. It looks like a woman in a grey uniform putting down a breakfast tray. It looks like crouching in a hallway at 3 in the morning to talk gently to an old woman who's looking for a dog that died 20 years ago. It looks small. It looks like nothing. And that's exactly why most people walk past it. Lena didn't walk past it. Not once, not in 8 months, not when she had every practical reason to keep her head down and protect the paycheck her mother's health depended on. She saw Eleanor, and she chose to show up for her fully, not because anyone was watching, not because there was anything in it for her, but because that's who Lena was when no one was looking. That's character. That's the kind of moral backbone that doesn't develop overnight and can't be faked in a crisis. It either lives in you or it doesn't. But I also think about how she handled the hard part. She didn't just have a good heart. She used her head, those 8 months of careful observation, of quietly noticing what felt wrong in rooms where she was supposed to be invisible, of filing away dates and conversations and the specific way a medication cabinet had been disturbed. That wasn't luck. That was a woman who paid attention even when no one thought she was paying attention. When the moment came and she walked into Roman's study, she didn't come empty-handed. She came with specifics. She came with a timeline. She came with exactly the information that changed everything. Kindness alone doesn't dismantle a 20-year leverage play. You have to be clear-eyed enough to see what's actually happening and precise enough to act on it accurately. And then there's the part that I find hardest to articulate, which is simply that she kept going. She kept showing up for Eleanor through 8 months of aching knees and cruel glances and a paycheck that didn't reflect a fraction of what she was actually doing. She didn't wait to be recognized before deciding she mattered. She didn't scale her effort to the appreciation she received. She just kept doing the right thing, one morning at a time, because she had decided that Eleanor mattered, and that was enough reason. The outcomes in Lena's story: Roman seeing her, Clarissa being removed, her mother's prescriptions covered, the slow, strange warmth that grew in a winter garden. None of that happened because she was angling for it. It happened because when you consistently act with integrity, use your intelligence honestly, and refuse to quit on the people who need you, reality tends to reorganize itself in your direction eventually. Not always. Not on a schedule, but the alternative. Looking away, going small, staying invisible by choice rather than circumstance. That has its own costs, ones that compound quietly over time. Lena Beaumont walked into a service job and left it having changed the architecture of one of the most powerful households on the eastern seaboard. Not because she was exceptional in the ways that get noticed, because she was exceptional in the ways that matter. I think about that tray she set down. How it took maybe 2 seconds. How everything that followed came from those 2 seconds.